A 4-year-old boy clutches his stuffed lion barefoot at a gas station. His tiny hands tremble as he tugs on a cop's uniform and whispers one word: drunk. Moments later, his father is pulled from a truck, reeking of whiskey, slurring protests before collapsing into sobs. But as the handcuffs click shut, the boy doesn't look relieved. He screams for his dad, his world shattering. What happens when love and destruction come from the same hands? And when the word that ruins a man might also be the only thing that saves him? Stay till the end, because this story will change everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The fluorescent lights of the gas station cast harsh shadows across the empty parking lot as Officer Daniel Hayes responded to the late-night dispatch call. His cruiser's headlights swept across the scene, illuminating a clerk wildly gesturing and shouting at a beaten-up pickup truck parked crookedly near the front door. The truck's engine rumbled in the quiet night, driver's door hanging open like a broken wing, the metal creaking softly in the evening breeze. Hayes pulled up slowly, taking in the situation. Through the truck's windshield, he could see a man, Jake Turner. He'd recognize him anywhere after all these years of similar calls, slumped over the steering wheel. Jake's head lolled to one side, his eyes barely open, mouth moving without forming real words. An empty whiskey bottle clinked against the floor pedals with each of Jake's unsteady movements, the sharp sound echoing in the cab. But it was the small figure in the passenger seat that made Hayes' heart sink. 4-year-old Eli Turner sat perfectly still, his tiny bare feet dangling above the floor mat, toes curled from the cold. His stuffed lion, worn from years of love, was clutched tightly to his chest, its matted mane telling stories of countless nights of comfort. The boy's eyes were wide with fear as they darted between the angry clerk and his father's limp form, his lower lip quivering. "Sir, he almost hit the gas pumps," the clerk called out as Hayes approached, his voice cracking with anger and concern. "I came out to check the price signs and saw him swerving into the lot. He's completely out of it. Nearly took out the whole station." Hayes nodded grimly and walked to the driver's side, rapping his knuckles hard against the window. Jake barely moved, but the smell of alcohol wafted through the open door, strong enough to make Hayes' eyes water. A small movement caught his attention. Eli had carefully climbed down from his seat and was now standing beside the truck, trembling in the cool night air, his pajama pants dotted with tiny rocket ships. The boy took a hesitant step toward Hayes, his stuffed lion dragging on the ground behind him like a faithful companion. With a tiny hand, he reached out and tugged at the officer's uniform pants, his fingers leaving small wrinkles in the crisp fabric. Hayes knelt down to the child's level, and Eli leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper, warm breath ghosting against Hayes' ear. Drunk. That single word, spoken with such sad familiarity from a 4-year-old's lips, hit Hayes like a physical blow. The resignation in that small voice told a story no child should know how to tell. He straightened up and reached into the truck, grabbing Jake's shoulder firmly. "Mr. Turner, wake up." Jake's head rolled to the side, his words slurring together in nonsense, spittle gathering at the corners of his mouth. When Hayes tried to help him out of the vehicle, Jake's arm swung wildly, a clumsy attempt at a punch that missed Hayes completely. Jake's momentum carried him forward, and he collapsed into the officer's arms, dead weight, reeking of whiskey and defeat. The sudden movement startled Eli, who let out a terrified scream that pierced the night air and echoed across the empty lot. The boy clutched his lion even tighter, backing away slightly as Hayes wrestled with his father, his small feet shuffling against the rough pavement. "Dispatch, I need backup at the Shell station on Route 16. Hayes spoke into his radio, trying to keep his voice steady and professional. "And get CPS out here. We've got a minor involved." He managed to get the handcuffs on Jake, who was now mumbling something about needing to get home, the metal clicking shut with a sound of finality. As Hayes began moving Jake toward the patrol car, Eli's cries grew more desperate, rising in pitch and intensity. "Daddy!" he called out, reaching toward his father with one small hand, the other still gripping his stuffed animal so tight his knuckles were white. Jake's head just lolled forward, too far gone to even acknowledge his son's pleas, his feet dragging trails in the dirt. The clerk stood in the doorway of the station, his earlier anger now tempered with visible pity as he watched the scene unfold, absently wringing his hands. Jake's feet dragged on the pavement as Hayes guided him to the cruiser, leaving scuff marks on his worn work boots. "I'm taking care of my boy," Jake slurred, his knees suddenly giving out. Hayes had to grab him under the arms to keep him from falling face first onto the concrete, the weight of him nearly pulling them both down. "I'm a good father." The words came out thick and desperate, a lie even Jake couldn't believe. As Hayes secured Jake in the back seat, Eli's heartbreaking sobs echoed through the empty parking lot, each cry seeming to bounce off the surrounding buildings and return even more painful than before. The officer turned back to the boy, placing a gentle hand on his small shoulder, but Eli was beyond comfort, his whole body shaking with each gut-wrenching cry, tears streaming down his flushed cheeks and soaking into the collar of his pajama top. The police cruiser cut through the midnight darkness, its interior silent except for the soft whimpers coming from the small boy in the front seat. Eli sat perfectly still, his stuffed lion pressed so tightly against his chest that his knuckles had turned white. His bare feet barely reached the edge of the seat, toes curling and uncurling with each quiet sob. The thin dinosaur pajamas he wore offered little comfort against the car's cold leather seats. Officer Hayes kept glancing in his rearview mirror at Jake Turner, who swayed back and forth in the back seat, handcuffed hands resting in his lap. The smell of whiskey filled the car's interior, making Hayes crack his window slightly. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of approaching rain. "I'm sorry," Jake mumbled, his head rolling against the window. "So sorry." His words were thick and heavy, weighed down by more than just alcohol. The streetlights cast alternating patterns of light and shadow across Eli's tear-stained face. His eyes remained fixed forward, but every time his father spoke, his small body tensed up like a spring ready to snap. His tiny fingers twisted deeper into the lion's matted fur. Suddenly, Jake jerked upright, his bloodshot eyes wild and confused. He looked around the police car's interior, panic rising in his voice. "Where's my boy? Where's Eli?" His chains rattled as he shifted, trying to see through his alcohol-induced haze. Eli turned in his seat, his bottom lip trembling as fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. Jake pressed his face against the clear divider between them, leaving smudges where his forehead met the plastic. His breath fogged the barrier between them. "Don't take my boy," Jake pleaded, his words slurring together. "Please, he's all I got." His voice cracked with desperation, hands pressing against the divider. Officer Hayes kept driving, his jaw set tight. He'd heard these same desperate words countless times before, seen this same scene play out over and over. The promises, the pleading, the tears. They all faded away once the alcohol wore off. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as he fought to maintain his professional composure. "Officer, please," Jake tried again, his voice cracking. "I can do better. I will do better." The words hung in the air, hollow promises he'd made too many times before. Hayes maintained his silence, focusing on the road ahead. Beside him, Eli had turned to stare out the passenger window, watching the world rush by in a blur of streetlights and shadows. His small hand pressed against the cold glass, leaving tiny fingerprints. When they pulled into the station's parking lot, another officer was already waiting. She opened Eli's door, reaching in to lift him out, but the boy shrank back against the seat, pressing himself as far away as possible. "No!" Eli cried out, his small hands clutching at the seatbelt. "Daddy!" His voice rose in panic, high and frightened. Jake struggled to get out of the back seat, his legs barely supporting his weight as an officer grabbed his arm to steady him. "Eli!" he called out, but his voice was weak and unfocused, dissolving into the night air. A CPS worker approached, her face gentle as she reached for Eli. The boy thrashed in the officer's arms, reaching desperately toward his father. "Daddy! Daddy!" His screams echoed through the empty parking lot. Jake could only watch, barely able to stand as two officers guided him toward the station's entrance. His son's heartbreaking sobs echoed off the building's brick walls, growing fainter as the CPS worker carried him away. Each cry was like a knife twisting in his gut. Officer Hayes stood in the parking lot, watching as Eli's small form disappeared into the worker's car, his cries still audible even through the closed doors. The boy's stuffed lion lay forgotten on the cruiser's front seat, a silent witness to another family torn apart. Its glass eyes seemed to reflect the tragedy unfolding before it. With a heavy sigh, Hayes turned and walked back into the station. In the holding area, Jake sat slumped in a metal chair, his head buried in his cuffed hands. The fight had drained out of him, leaving behind nothing but a broken man who'd lost everything that mattered. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as reality began to sink in through the alcoholic fog. The harsh fluorescent light stabbed at Jake's eyes as consciousness crept back painfully. His mouth felt like sandpaper, and his head throbbed with each thundering heartbeat. The cold concrete wall pressed against his back as he tried to sit up, his stomach lurching in violent protest. The familiar symptoms of withdrawal were already setting in: trembling hands, cold sweats, and a deep, gnawing nausea that twisted through his gut like a knife. Jake squinted at his surroundings, the gray holding cell swimming into focus, empty except for a metal toilet, a thin mattress with suspicious stains, and the hard bench he sat on. The events of last night crashed over him in merciless waves: the flickering lights of the gas station, Officer Hayes' stern face, Eli's terrified eyes brimming with tears. Eli. The thought of his son sent a fresh wave of burning shame through him, making his chest ache. The cell door's hinges creaked like rusty bones, and Jake winced at the piercing sound. A woman in a neat navy suit stepped in, holding a worn manila folder. Her heels clicked sharply against the concrete floor. "Mr. Turner, I'm Sarah Lawson, your court-appointed attorney." Jake tried to stand but swayed dangerously, his legs unsteady beneath him. Sarah gestured for him to stay seated as she pulled up the room's only chair, its metal legs scraping against the floor. "Let's get straight to the point," she said, opening her folder with practiced efficiency. "You're facing multiple charges: DUI, child endangerment, and resisting arrest. None of them look good." "I wasn't resisting," Jake started, his voice rough like gravel. "I just needed to explain." "Save it," Sarah cut him off firmly, her eyes sharp with experience. "The judge isn't in the mood for excuses, not with your history, and certainly not with a 4-year-old involved. You're lucky nobody got hurt." Jake's stomach twisted violently, but not from the hangover this time. "Where's Eli? Is he okay? Please, I need to know." Sarah's expression softened slightly, a crack in her professional facade. "He's been placed in temporary custody with your mother, Evelyn Turner." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He lurched to his feet, ignoring the room spinning wildly around him, and slammed his fists against the concrete wall. Pain shot through his hands, but he barely felt it. "No, not her. She abandoned me. She doesn't get to—" His voice broke as anger and despair overwhelmed him, choking off his words. "Mr. Turner?" Sarah's voice was stern but not unkind, like a teacher correcting a wayward student. "Your previous failed attempt at rehab isn't helping your case. The judge will see that as a pattern, not a one-time mistake. You need to think clearly about this." Jake paced the small cell like a caged animal, his breathing ragged and shallow. His hands ran through his unwashed hair repeatedly. "You don't understand. My mother, she left me with my father when I was just a kid, just walked away. She doesn't deserve to have Eli. She can't have him. The court sees a grandmother with a stable home and no history of substance abuse," Sarah explained, her words measured and careful. "They see a father who drove drunk with his child in the car. Which would you choose? Think about it from their perspective." Jake's legs gave out and he sank back onto the bench, the metal cold through his jeans. His hands wouldn't stop shaking, no matter how tightly he clasped them together. "Your court appearance is scheduled for this afternoon," Sarah continued, gathering her papers with efficient movements. She stood and looked down at Jake, her expression serious, but tinged with something that might have been sympathy. "This is your last shot, Jake. Either you commit to rehab and prove you can stay clean, or you lose Eli forever. There won't be another chance." Jake buried his face in his trembling hands, the weight of his choices crushing down on him like an avalanche. The cell door creaked again as Sarah left, her footsteps echoing down the corridor, leaving him alone with his demons and the haunting image of his son's frightened face. The courtroom's wooden benches creaked as Jake shifted uncomfortably, his knuckles white from gripping the edge of the defense table. His public defender, Sarah, sat beside him, her posture straight and professional, but Jake could barely focus on her whispered instructions. The smell of lemon polish and stale air filled his nostrils as he fought against the tremors in his hands, a constant reminder of how badly he needed a drink. He refused to turn around, knowing Evelyn was there, sitting somewhere behind him. Her presence burned into his back like a hot coal. The thought of his mother, who'd abandoned him years ago, now having custody of his son, made bile rise in his throat. He could still remember the day she left, the sound of the screen door slamming shut behind her. Eli's small figure caught his peripheral vision, the stuffed lion's worn fabric clutched against his chest like a shield. The sight of his son made Jake's heart constrict painfully. Dark circles shadowed Eli's eyes, evidence of sleepless nights that were Jake's fault. The boy's pajamas were clean and pressed, Evelyn's doing, no doubt, a stark contrast to the rumpled mess they'd been in Jake's care. The judge's voice boomed through the courtroom, each word hammering against Jake's skull like a physical blow. "Mr. Turner, your record shows a pattern of failed rehabilitation attempts and broken promises. 3 attempts in the past year alone." Jake's mouth opened to protest, but the words died in his throat. What could he say? That this time would be different? He'd made that promise before, standing in this very spot, swearing he'd change. "Your Honor, Jake started, his voice rough with emotion and dehydration. "Save it, Mr. Turner," the judge cut him off, peering over his glasses with eyes that had seen too many cases like this. "I've heard every excuse in the book. This isn't about you anymore. This is about your son." The mention of Eli made Jake's shoulders slump. He heard a small sniffle from the back of the courtroom, the sound piercing his heart like an arrow. "Here's my ruling," the judge continued, his tone leaving no room for argument, each word falling like a gavel strike. 90 days inpatient rehabilitation. No exceptions, no early release. If you fail to complete the program or test positive for any substances, you will permanently lose all parental rights. Do you understand? Jake nodded numbly, his throat too tight to speak, his mind already racing with the thought of 3 months without a drink. "I need a verbal response, Mr. Turner." "Yes, Your Honor," Jake managed to croak out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The bailiff approached with handcuffs, their metal links jingling in the quiet courtroom like a harsh wind chime. Jake stood on shaky legs, letting his arms be pulled behind his back. The cold steel clicked around his wrists, each click echoing with finality. As the bailiff guided him toward the side door, Jake finally allowed himself to look at Evelyn. Her face was a mask of carefully controlled emotions, but her eyes held something he couldn't quite read. Was it pity? Disappointment? Or maybe, buried deep beneath years of hurt, a glimmer of hope? She looked older than he remembered, lines of worry etched around her mouth. Then came the moment that shattered everything. "Please, Daddy. Try." Eli's small voice cut through the courtroom like a knife, clear and pure. Jake froze mid-step, his son's plea hitting him harder than any judge's sentence ever could. He turned slowly, meeting Eli's tear-filled eyes, those eyes so much like his own. Something broke inside Jake's chest, the carefully constructed walls of denial, the years of excuses, the anger he'd used to shield himself. They all crumbled in the face of those 2 simple words from his 4-year-old son. The truth hit him with stunning clarity. He'd been fighting the wrong battle all along. For the first time, Jake saw himself clearly through Eli's eyes, not as the failure he believed himself to be, or the lost cause others saw, but as a father. Someone worth believing in, someone worth asking to try, someone who could still change. He stood there, handcuffed and broken, while that single word echoed in his mind like a prayer. Try. The rehab facility rose before Jake like a fortress of pale concrete and barred windows. As he stepped out of the police transport van, his legs wobbled beneath him, still weak from days in holding. The morning air bit through his thin jacket, making him shiver. His wrists ached where the handcuffs had dug into his skin during the ride, leaving angry red marks that he couldn't stop staring at. A broad-shouldered man in faded blue scrubs waited by the entrance. "I'm Gerald Ross," he said, his voice gruff but steady. "I'll be your intake nurse." His salt and pepper hair and lined face spoke of decades dealing with people like Jake. His eyes held a mixture of compassion and unwavering authority that made Jake want to look away. Jake followed Gerald through heavy security doors that clicked shut behind them with finality. The hallways stretched out in endless white fluorescent lights humming overhead like angry wasps. Other residents shuffled past in gray sweats, eyes downcast, shoulders slumped. Their defeated expressions made Jake's stomach turn. Some of them looked like they'd given up entirely, while others had the desperate, haunted look of people still fighting their demons. "This isn't a prison," Gerald explained as they walked, his footsteps echoing against the linoleum floors. "But we have strict rules. No outside contact for the first month. That means no calls, no visits." He paused at a nurse's station where a woman in scrubs was sorting medications into small paper cups. "Mandatory individual therapy 3 times a week, daily group sessions. You'll be expected to participate fully in your recovery." Jake let out a harsh laugh that scraped his throat raw. "I'm not like these people," he spat, gesturing at a gaunt man who crept past them, hands trembling like autumn leaves. The sight of his future self in that man's hollow eyes terrified him more than he could admit. Gerald's weathered face hardened, deep lines appearing around his mouth. Everyone here said that at first. His eyes held Jake's gaze with the weight of countless similar conversations. Every single one. They reached a small room at the end of a quiet hallway. A metal cot jutted from one wall, its thin mattress covered in standard-issue sheets that smelled of industrial bleach. A metal desk stood bolted to the floor, its surface scratched and worn from years of restless hands. The window, reinforced with wire mesh, let in weak morning light that cast prison bar shadows across the bare floor. "Strip down," Gerald ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We need to inventory your belongings." Jake's hands shook as he removed his clothes, each item feeling like another piece of his identity being stripped away. They took everything: his wallet, his watch, even his shoelaces. Only one item remained: a creased photograph of Eli smiling gap-toothed at the camera, clutching his stuffed lion. The sight of his son's innocent face made Jake's chest ache with a pain deeper than any physical withdrawal. The withdrawal hit like a freight train within hours. Jake's body revolted against the absence of alcohol, every nerve ending screaming for relief as though his very cells were being torn apart. Sweat soaked through his new gray sweatsuit as violent tremors racked his frame, making his teeth chatter uncontrollably. He barely made it to the small bathroom before the first wave of vomiting struck, his knees bruising against the cold tile floor. Muscle cramps seized his legs and back, making him cry out like a wounded animal. The fluorescent lights became daggers in his skull as migraines pulsed behind his eyes, each heartbeat bringing fresh waves of agony. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, forcing water and medication into him. Jake could barely focus on their faces through the haze of pain, their voices floating above him like distant radio static. In his fever dreams, his father's voice echoed through his head, as clear as if the man were standing beside his bed. "Worthless," it snarled with familiar venom. "Just like your mother. Weak." Jake thrashed against the sheets, trying to escape the memories that haunted him even here. His father's face morphed into his own, sneering down at Eli with the same contempt. 3 days blurred together in an endless cycle of pain that seemed to have no beginning or end. Jake begged the nurses for relief, cursed them when they refused with practiced patience, then broke down sobbing as another wave of nausea hit. Through it all, he clutched Eli's photo like a lifeline, the edges growing soft and worn from his desperate grip, his son's smile the only light in his personal darkness. Finally, exhaustion won out. Jake collapsed onto the sweat-soaked sheets, his body too spent to fight anymore. The photo of his son remained pressed against his chest as consciousness slipped away, Eli's whispered "try" following him into uneasy dreams. The moonlight cast long shadows across the guest room's beige carpet as Eli perched on the edge of the bed, his small frame rigid with tension. His stuffed lion, worn and loved, pressed against his chest like armor. The room felt too big, Too neat, too different from the cramped apartment he shared with his dad. No familiar sense of leather and coffee, no comforting hum of the old ceiling fan that helped him sleep. Even the air felt wrong here. Too clean, too still, missing the city sounds that usually drifted through his bedroom window. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her hand resting uncertainly on the frame. She watched her grandson, seeing echoes of Jake at that age. The same dark curls, the same wounded eyes, even the way his shoulders hunched forward when he was scared. The silence between them felt heavy, loaded with unspoken words. "Time for bed, sweetheart," Evelyn said softly, taking a tentative step into the room. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, making Eli jump slightly. She paused, her heart aching at his reaction, remembering how she used to startle at sudden noises too. When she sat beside him on the bed, Eli shifted away slightly, his small fingers digging into the lion's matted fur. The bed was perfectly made, corners tucked with military precision, so different from the tangled blankets and mismatched sheets at home. The crisp cotton sheets felt stiff and foreign against his skin. "I miss Daddy," Eli whispered, his voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. His words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. A single tear rolled down his cheek, catching the moonlight. Evelyn's chest tightened painfully. She reached for the framed photograph on the nightstand, her fingers tracing the edge of the silver frame. In it, a young Jake smiled at the camera, missing his front teeth, wearing a too big baseball cap. The same age as Eli was now. The same dimple in his left cheek when he smiled. "He was just like you," she admitted quietly, showing Eli the photo. But her grandson turned away, pressing his face into his lion's mane. The rejection stung, but Evelyn understood. Trust had to be earned, one small moment at a time. She pulled a worn copy of Goodnight Moon from the bedside table. "Would you like a story?" she offered, keeping her voice gentle. Eli shook his head, still not looking at her, his small body trembling with suppressed sobs. Minutes ticked by on the grandfather clock downstairs, its steady rhythm echoing through the quiet house. Evelyn watched helplessly as Eli curled into himself, making himself as small as possible on the large bed. His lion remained clutched tightly against his chest, its threadbare tail wrapped around his arm like a safety line in a storm. The night stretched on. Eli's eyes remained fixed on the wall, wide and unblinking, until exhaustion finally won out. His breathing gradually steadied, his grip on the lion loosening slightly as sleep claimed him. Even in sleep, his face held a worried frown. Evelyn sat in the old rocking chair by the window, an album open in her lap. Moonlight illuminated a family photo. Jake as a toddler, herself younger and scared, her ex-husband's shadow looming in the background. Her fingers traced Jake's innocent smile, remembering how that smile had dimmed over the years, replaced by the same haunted look she now saw in Eli's eyes. The chair's gentle creaking provided a rhythm to her thoughts. "I won't let you make the same mistakes," she whispered into the darkness, as if Jake could hear her across the distance between them. The promise felt both heavy and hopeful in the quiet room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the sterile therapy room as Jake slouched in his metal chair, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His eyes, bloodshot from another sleepless night, narrowed at the circle of addicts around him. The familiar ache of withdrawal pulsed behind his temples as he studied the worn faces of his fellow patients, each one a mirror he didn't want to look into. Linda Foster, the rehab counselor, sat with perfect posture, her kind face masking years of experience with resistant patients like Jake. "Would anyone like to share their story today?" Linda's voice was gentle but firm, her clipboard balanced carefully on her knee. Troy, a young man with hollow cheeks and nervous hands, cleared his throat. I lost everything to heroin. My wife left. Took our son with her." His voice cracked. "Haven't seen them in 2 years." His fingers twisted the wedding ring he still wore, a habit Jake had noticed over the past few days. Jake let out a derisive snort, shaking his head. "What? You think whining about it fixes anything?" The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. The room fell silent. Linda turned her steady gaze to Jake, her pen poised mid-note. "Then why are you here, Jake?" Something snapped inside him. He shot to his feet, the metal chair screeching against the linoleum floor. "Because some judge thinks rehab will fix me." His voice echoed off the walls as he stormed toward the door, his fist connecting with the wall in a burst of pain and anger. Blood trickled from his split knuckles, but he barely noticed. The impact sent shockwaves up his arm, a familiar kind of pain he almost welcomed. Outside, his trembling hands fumbled with a contraband cigarette, the lighter flame dancing in the morning breeze. The morning air was crisp, but Jake's skin felt like it was on fire. Gerald's heavy footsteps approached from behind, the nurse's boots scuffing against the concrete. "You think you're better than them?" The nurse's voice was gruff, challenging, "because all I see is a man too scared to admit he's drowning." Gerald's weathered face showed no sympathy, just the hard truth Jake wasn't ready to hear. Jake's lip curled into a sneer, but the words died in his throat. He took a long drag of his cigarette, ignoring the blood dripping from his hand onto his worn jeans. The next few days became a blur of resistance. Jake sat stone-faced through therapy sessions, refusing to speak, counting the ceiling tiles instead of listening. At night, his father's voice haunted him, calling him worthless, weak, just like always. The withdrawal symptoms didn't help, leaving him sweating and shaking in his bed, his sheets soaked through by morning. He paced his room like a caged animal, shoving away trays of food, snapping at anyone who tried to help, the walls seeming to close in with each passing hour. "If you don't engage with the program," one counselor warned, her clipboard clutched to her chest like armor, "you won't make it through." Jake ignored them all until Linda cornered him after another failed session, catching him as he tried to slip away unnoticed. Her eyes were hard, her voice flat and uncompromising. "Either fight for your son or stay here and rot." Jake's fists clenched at his sides, but for the first time since arriving, the words pierced through his armor of anger. He stood there, trembling, as the truth of her statement sank deep into his bones. The image of Eli's face flashed through his mind, and something inside him began to crack. The visitors' room hummed with quiet conversation and occasional laughter as families reunited with their loved ones. Evelyn Turner sat rigid in her chair, her cream-colored blouse pressed perfectly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes darted to the door each time it opened, but Jake never appeared. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the institutional green walls, making the room feel colder than it was. Around her, other patients embraced their families, some with tears streaming down their faces, others with cautious smiles. A young woman hugged her children while her husband watched proudly. An elderly couple held hands with their daughter, who looked healthier than she had in years. A teenage boy wrapped his arms around his father, both of them crying openly. The scene made Evelyn's chest ache with a familiar emptiness, a void she'd carried for far too long. After 30 minutes of waiting, a nurse with kind eyes and graying hair approached her. Her name tag read, Patricia. "Mrs. Turner?" The nurse's voice was gentle but carried a note of apology. "I'm sorry, but Jake refuses to come out of his room. He's having a difficult day." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she managed to keep her voice steady. Years of practice had taught her how to contain her emotions, how to keep them locked away where they couldn't hurt anyone. She stood up, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her skirt, her fingers trembling slightly despite her composed exterior. "Can I?" She paused, clearing her throat against the tightness building there. "Can I leave him something?" The nurse nodded sympathetically as Evelyn reached into her purse. Her fingers found the old photograph, its edges worn soft from years of handling. She pulled it out carefully, looking down at the image of herself and Jake at the county carnival. He was 7 years old, cotton candy stuck to his cheeks, wearing a too-big baseball cap and the biggest smile she'd ever seen. The Ferris wheel glowed behind them in the twilight. It was before everything fell apart, before the fear and the running and the guilt that never quite went away, before she made the choice that would haunt them both. "Tell him I'll be back next week," Evelyn said, handing over the photo. Her voice caught slightly on the words, but she held herself together. She always did. It was what she knew best. That evening, Jake lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling he'd memorized over the past 2 weeks. The photo sat untouched, where the nurse had left it on his metal nightstand. He could see it from the corner of his eye, that moment frozen in time taunting him with memories he'd rather forget. The setting sun cast long shadows through the barred windows, painting stripes across his small room. As night fell and the facility grew quiet, save for the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes in the hallway, Jake finally reached for the photograph. His calloused fingers traced the edges as he held it above his face. The carnival lights in the background, his mother's arm around his shoulders, his own gap-toothed grin. It all seemed to belong to someone else's life. The happiness in that photo felt like a cruel joke now. He gripped the photo tightly, fighting the urge to crumple it, to tear it to pieces like she had torn apart their family. But something stopped him. Maybe it was exhaustion, or the weeks of forced sobriety, or just the weight of too many years carrying anger like armor. His hands shook as he lowered the photo to his chest. When morning came, the photograph still sat on his nightstand, slightly bent but intact. Jake lay awake in his bed, picking up the photo again and again, turning it over in his hands as if it might reveal some hidden truth about why everything had gone so wrong. His throat felt tight with unspoken words. The night stretched on, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder what might happen if he stopped fighting so hard against the possibility of letting her back in. Maybe, just maybe, there was something left worth saving. The sharp rap of knuckles against his door jolted Jake from his fitful sleep. His head throbbed, a familiar ache from nights filled with dreams of Eli being torn from his arms over and over. The same nightmare had haunted him for weeks now, leaving him drained and hollow each morning. He blinked at the harsh fluorescent light streaming in from the hallway, where Gerald's broad frame filled the doorway. "This came for you," Gerald said, his voice unusually gentle as he held up a small white envelope. The counselor's eyes held a knowing softness that made Jake uncomfortable. Jake pushed himself up on his elbows, eyeing the envelope with suspicion. His heart nearly stopped when he saw the wobbly handwriting on the front. Childish letters that could only belong to one person: Eli. The sight of it made his stomach flip with equal parts hope and fear. His hands trembled as he snatched the envelope from Gerald, who quietly stepped back and closed the door. Jake sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his name written in uneven blue crayon. The paper felt impossibly delicate in his rough hands, like it might crumble under the weight of his mistakes. For several long minutes he just held it, afraid of what might be inside. What could his 4-year-old say to the father who had failed him so completely? The silence in the room pressed against his ears as he wrestled with his courage. Finally, unable to bear the suspense any longer, he carefully tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, crumpled slightly at the corners. 4 words were written across the top in wobbly red crayon: "I love you, Daddy." Below the message was a drawing, 2 stick figures holding hands. The taller one had spiky hair like Jake's, while the smaller one clutched what looked like Eli's stuffed lion. The simplicity of it made his heart ache. Jake's chest constricted painfully. His vision blurred as tears welled up in his eyes, dropping onto the paper and making the crayon colors run slightly. He hadn't cried since arriving at rehab, hadn't let himself feel anything beyond anger and resentment. But now, looking at his son's innocent declaration of love, something inside him cracked wide open. All the walls he'd built started crumbling down. He rubbed roughly at his face with the heel of his hand, trying to wipe away the tears. But they kept coming. The weight of what he stood to lose crashed over him like a wave. "I can't lose him," he whispered to the empty room, his voice hoarse. "I can't." The words felt like both a promise and a plea. That evening, when group therapy began, Jake didn't slouch in his chair or roll his eyes at others' stories. He sat up straight, actually listening as Troy talked about his first phone call with his son after 6 months of sobriety. The man's voice shook with emotion as he described hearing his child's laughter again. For the first time, Jake saw himself in these people he'd dismissed as weak. They were all fighting to get back to someone they loved. Later that night, Jake carefully folded Eli's letter and placed it next to the old carnival photo of him and Evelyn. The happy faces in that faded picture seemed to mock him now, reminding him of all he'd thrown away. He lay back on his narrow bed, staring up at the water-stained ceiling tiles. "I love you, Daddy," he whispered into the darkness, letting the words wash over him like a prayer. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to become the father Eli deserved. The visitor's room hummed with quiet conversation and the occasional scrape of metal chairs against linoleum floors. Evelyn sat perfectly straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gray hair neatly pinned back. Around her, other families embraced and chatted, sharing snacks and stories. But she kept her eyes fixed on the doorway, counting each second that passed. When Jake appeared, her breath caught in her throat. He looked different, thinner, but somehow stronger, with his shoulders set in a way she hadn't seen in years. His eyes were clear, lacking their usual glazed anger, and his face had lost its haunted, hollow look. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, arms crossed defensively over his chest, studying her with an unreadable expression that made her heart ache. "I didn't think you'd come out," Evelyn said softly, breaking the heavy silence between them. Her voice wavered slightly, betraying her nervousness. Jake's voice was rough when he finally spoke, like sandpaper against wood. "Neither did I." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they stared at each other, decades of hurt and betrayal hanging in the air between them like an invisible wall. Evelyn's fingers trembled slightly as she reached into her worn leather purse. She pulled out a creased photograph and slid it across the table, her hand lingering for just a moment before pulling away. Jake didn't move at first, but his eyes dropped to the image, drawn despite himself. It showed a much younger Evelyn, her face bright with joy as she cradled a baby, him in her arms. Her smile in the photo was genuine, full of love and hope, untouched by the years of pain that would follow. "I wasn't always a bad mother," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, fragile as tissue paper. Jake's jaw clenched as he stared at the photograph, a muscle twitching in his cheek. His fingers twitched at his sides, but he didn't reach for it, as if touching it might burn him. "I know I made mistakes," Evelyn continued, her voice cracking slightly under the weight of her confession. "Leaving you with him, I thought I was protecting myself, but I was just being a coward. I should have taken you with me. Not a day goes by that I don't regret that choice." Jake's shoulders tensed at her words, but he didn't interrupt. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, heavy with unspoken words and buried pain that had festered for decades. "I see him in Eli sometimes," she admitted, softening at the mention of her grandson. "The way he looks at you, it's the same way you used to look at me, before everything fell apart." Jake's hand finally moved, reaching out to grip the photograph. His knuckles went white around the edges, but he was careful not to crease it, treating it with a gentleness that surprised them both. When visiting hours ended, signaled by a gentle chime over the intercom, Jake stood abruptly. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, making Evelyn flinch at the harsh sound. He kept the photograph clutched in his fist, still not meeting her eyes, but his posture had softened almost imperceptibly. Just before turning away, he muttered, "Maybe next time you can bring Eli." The words came out gruff, but held a hint of vulnerability that made Evelyn's heart squeeze. Evelyn watched him walk away, her vision blurring with unshed tears. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt a tiny spark of hope flicker in her chest, fragile but determined to stay alive. The darkness pressed against the rehab facility's windows as Jake lay in his narrow bed, unable to sleep. The moonlight cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the two items on his nightstand: Eli's crayon-written letter and the old photograph of him with Evelyn. His eyes traced the water stains on the ceiling, following their twisted patterns like roads on a map, trying to quiet his racing thoughts. The thin mattress creaked beneath him with every restless movement. But the memories came anyway, rushing in like an unstoppable tide. His father's thunderous footsteps up the stairs, each heavy thud making the floorboards groan in protest. The sharp crack of a belt against skin. The sour smell of whiskey that always meant pain was coming. That familiar scent that still made his stomach clench even decades later. Jake's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white against the thin sheets that offered no comfort. "Get out of my head," he whispered hoarsely, but the memories kept flowing, vivid and merciless. He was 8 years old again, hiding in his closet, pressing his small hands against his ears to block out the sound of breaking glass downstairs, tasting salt tears on his lips. He was 12, learning to read his father's moods like weather patterns, to disappear before the storm hit, becoming a ghost in his own home. He was 15, staring at the front door his mother had walked through for the last time, the sound of her car engine fading into nothing. Evelyn's words from their visit echoed in his mind. I wasn't always a bad mother. Jake turned onto his side, facing the wall's peeling paint, but he couldn't escape the thought that followed him like a shadow. He remembered moments before everything fell apart, Evelyn reading him bedtime stories with different voices for each character, bandaging his scraped knees with gentle hands, singing softly while making dinner in their small kitchen. Her smile had been different then, warm and real before fear had carved permanent lines around her mouth and dulled the light in her eyes. The day she left played out in his mind with cruel clarity, every detail sharp as broken glass. He'd been doing homework at the kitchen table, math problems he couldn't focus on, when she walked past, her face blank but her hands shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists. She'd paused in the doorway, looking back at him with an expression he'd never been able to forget. Now, lying in his rehab bed, Jake wondered about that look, the raw pain in her eyes, the way her fingers had gripped the doorframe like she was fighting with herself, fighting against an invisible force. Had she wanted to take him? Had she tried before and failed, attempts he was too young to remember? The questions he'd never allowed himself to ask bubbled up like poison, along with a sick realization that hit him like a punch to the gut. Wasn't he doing the same thing to Eli? Not with bruises or screaming, but with his drinking, his absences, his broken promises that littered Eli's childhood like shattered glass. Self-hatred washed over him in a suffocating wave, thick and dark as tar. Jake sat up abruptly, swinging his legs over the side of the bed, the springs protesting beneath him. His hands found the letter and photo in the dark, gripping them until the edges crinkled. A ragged breath escaped him, somewhere between a sob and a sigh, echoing in the quiet room. Standing on shaky legs, he moved to the small mirror mounted on the wall, its frame chipped and worn. In the dim light, his reflection was barely visible, just the outline of a man he barely recognized anymore, a shadow of who he used to be. But as he stood there, something shifted in his perception, like a key turning in a rusty lock. He wasn't just his father's son, doomed to repeat the past like a curse. He wasn't just Evelyn's abandoned child carrying wounds that never healed right. He was Eli's father, and he still had a choice, still had time to write a different ending. Looking at his reflection, Jake made a silent promise, to his son, to himself, and to the scared little boy he used to be, the one who still lived somewhere in his heart. The promise felt different this time, solid and real, not like the empty words he'd thrown around before like confetti, watching them scatter and disappear. For the first time since entering rehab, Jake took a deep breath that reached all the way to his lungs, filling spaces that had been empty for too long. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, he would try. The word echoed in his mind in Eli's small voice, carrying hope like a lantern in the dark. The visitors area felt different today. Jake's hands trembled as he sat in the hard plastic chair, his eyes fixed on the entrance. The familiar sound of the security door buzzing made his heart race. When Evelyn walked in, Jake barely noticed her. All he could see was the small figure beside her. Eli stood there, his tattered stuffed lion clutched tightly against his chest. His sneakers were new, bright blue with white laces. His hair was neatly combed, but that one stubborn cowlick still stuck up in the back. Jake's throat tightened at the sight. Neither of them moved. The bustling sounds of other families faded away as father and son stared at each other across the room. Eli's eyes were wide, hopeful, but uncertain. Jake couldn't find his voice, couldn't even breathe properly. Finally, Jake lowered himself to one knee, opening his arms. The gesture broke something loose in Eli. With a sound between a sob and a whimper, the boy ran forward, his lion bouncing against his side. Jake caught him, pulling him close, breathing in the familiar scent of baby shampoo and that particular sweetness that was just Eli. "You okay, buddy?" Jake managed to whisper, his voice rough with emotion. He felt Eli nod against his shoulder. "Are you?" Eli's small voice was muffled against Jake's shirt. Jake forced his lips into a smile, though tears threatened to spill. "I'm getting there." They settled at the visitors' table, Eli refusing to leave Jake's lap. Evelyn sat quietly across from them, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes watchful. Jake noticed she'd brought Eli's favorite coloring book and crayons. "How's the new school?" Jake asked, helping Eli arrange his crayons in rainbow order, just the way he liked them. "It's okay," Eli said, selecting a blue crayon. "Miss Thompson lets me feed the class hamster." Jake listened intently as Eli chatted about his new toys, about how Grandma read him 3 stories every night, about the tree house in her backyard. Each detail was precious, filling in the gaps of the life Jake had missed. "I had a dream about you," Eli said suddenly, putting down his crayon. "Yeah?" Jake's arms tightened slightly around his son. "You came home," Eli said simply, "and you stayed forever and ever." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He swallowed hard, meeting Eli's trusting gaze. "One day I'll come home. I promise." Eli's face lit up with pure joy, and Jake felt the weight of that trust settle on his shoulders. He glanced at Evelyn, expecting to see doubt or judgment. Instead, she gave him a small, understanding nod. When the announcement came for the end of visiting hours, Eli's arms locked around Jake's neck. "Don't want to go," he mumbled. "I know, buddy," Jake whispered, his heart breaking all over again. "I know." Evelyn stood, gently reaching for Eli's hand. The boy finally loosened his grip, sliding off Jake's lap. Jake watched as Evelyn led Eli toward the door, feeling something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It felt like hope, fragile but real. Jake sat on the edge of his bed, his eyes fixed on the calendar hanging on the stark white wall. Red X's marked off each day of his journey, leading to tomorrow, the custody hearing. His stomach churned as he spread out the collection of letters from Eli across his blanket. Crayon drawings, misspelled words, and pure love poured from each page. "Miss you lots," one read in wobbly letters. "Grandma says you're getting better." The missing apostrophe made Jake smile despite his nerves. The evening group session buzzed with energy. Plastic chairs squeaked against linoleum as everyone gathered in a circle. Jake's palms were sweaty as he listened to others share their stories. When his turn came, he cleared his throat. 90 days, he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Never thought I'd make it this far." The room filled with supportive applause, but Jake barely heard it over the thundering of his own heart. After the meeting, Gerald approached him, holding out a small bronze token. "Here you go, Turner." Gerald pressed the chip into Jake's palm. 90 days clean. You made it this far. Don't screw it up now." Jake let out a shaky laugh. "Thanks for the vote of confidence." But as the night wore on, the weight in his chest grew heavier. Jake paced his room, 12 steps one way, 12 steps back. The same distance as his old jail cell. His thoughts raced with tomorrow's possibilities. What if the judge saw through him? What if all this wasn't enough? The old voices of doubt crept in, his father's sneering tone, his own self-loathing. Jake found himself staring at the exit doors at the end of the hall. It would be so easy to just walk away, to run before he could fail again. Instead, he reached for Eli's most recent letter. The paper was already worn from being read so many times. "I drew us at the park," Eli had written. "When you come home." Jake's hands shook as he walked back to his room. He sat heavily on his bed, clutching his sobriety token in one hand and Eli's letter in the other. The metal was warm against his palm, the paper soft between his fingers. "For him," he whispered into the darkness. "I do this for him." Jake bolted upright in his bed, his t-shirt soaked with sweat. The nightmare still gripped him, Eli's small hand slipping through his fingers, his son's terrified face fading into darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs as he tried to catch his breath. The dim light from the hallway cast long shadows across his room, making everything feel strange and threatening. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, pressing his palms against his eyes. The anxiety coursed through his body like electricity, making his hands shake and his stomach twist. Every nerve felt raw, exposed. The silence of the rehab facility at midnight only made his thoughts louder. Jake began to pace, his bare feet silent on the cold floor. 5 steps one way, 5 steps back. The walls seemed to close in with each turn. That's when the thought slithered in, familiar and poisonous. Just one drink would make this feeling stop. Just one to steady his nerves before tomorrow. No, he whispered to himself, but the voice in his head grew louder. What kind of father was he anyway? The judge would see right through him, would see the broken man pretending to be whole, would see his father in him. Before he knew what he was doing, his feet carried him to the door. The night staff was skeleton crew, just 2 nurses stationed at the front desk. Jake had watched their routines for weeks. He knew they took their coffee break at midnight, leaving the back exit temporarily unguarded. His heart pounded as he crept down the hallway, staying close to the walls. The exit sign glowed red in the darkness, like a beacon or a warning. The door opened with a soft click, and the cold night air hit his face like a slap. The streets were empty, quiet except for distant traffic. Jake walked quickly, trying to convince himself he just needed fresh air, but his feet knew where they were going. They always knew. 10 minutes later, he stood in front of O'Malley's bar, staring at the neon open sign that hummed and flickered in the darkness. His mouth went dry. 3 months of sobriety hung in the balance, but the pull was too strong. One step inside. The familiar smell of stale beer and cigarettes wrapped around him like an old friend. Another step. Jake slid onto a bar stool, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the bar. The bartender looked at him with tired eyes. "Whiskey," Jake heard himself say. "Double." The glass appeared in front of him, amber liquid catching the dim light. Jake wrapped his fingers around it, feeling its weight. The first sip burned, but oh God, the relief that followed. It spread through his chest, quieting the voices in his head. He took another drink, bigger this time, and another. Hours blurred together. At some point, he stumbled to a nearby motel, bottle in hand. The room spun as he collapsed onto the thin mattress. The last thing he saw before consciousness slipped away was the whiskey bottle tipping over, its contents spilling across the stained carpet. The fluorescent lights of the motel room pierced Jake's skull as loud banging echoed through the door. His stomach lurched, and the taste of stale whiskey coated his tongue. Empty bottles littered the floor around him, evidence of his spectacular failure. "Police, open up!" The voice was muffled but authoritative. Jake stumbled to his feet, the room spinning violently. Before he could reach the door, it burst open. 2 officers rushed in, their faces grim with disappointment and disgust. "Jake Turner, you're under arrest for violating the terms of your rehabilitation program." The words hit him like a physical blow. Reality crashed down as cold metal handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Everything he'd worked for, every promise he'd made, gone in one night of weakness. At the courthouse, the familiar wooden benches felt harder than ever. Jake's head throbbed with each heartbeat as he was led inside. Through bleary eyes, he caught sight of Eli's bright face turning toward him, watched that smile crumble into confusion. Evelyn sat rigid beside him, her jaw clenched tight, disappointment radiating from her in waves. Jake slumped into his chair, the room tilting slightly. His public defender, Sarah, wouldn't even look at him. The smell of alcohol still clung to his clothes, a damning testament to his failure. Judge Harrison's voice cut through the fog in Jake's head. "I have here a police report from last night." He held up a paper, his expression darkening with each line he read. "Found intoxicated in a motel room. Multiple empty bottles present, resisting arrest." Sarah stood, though her usual confidence was shaken. "Your Honor, my client has shown remarkable progress over the past 3 months. This was one setback." A setback? The judge's voice cracked like a whip. This man walked out of a court-mandated rehabilitation program to go on a drinking binge the night before his custody hearing. That's not a setback, counselor. That's a choice. Jake's throat burned with shame. He could feel Eli's eyes on him, could sense the confusion and hurt radiating from his son. He wanted to explain, to make them understand the fear that had driven him out into the night, but no words came. I should terminate your parental rights today, Judge Harrison continued, his tone heavy with disappointment. Give your son a chance at stability. The words knocked the air from Jake's lungs. He forced himself to look up, finally finding his voice. I messed up. The words came out rough, broken. Tears burned his eyes as he continued. But please, don't take my son away from me. The courtroom fell silent. Jake's shoulders shook as he tried to hold back sobs. Then, quick footsteps broke the silence. Before anyone could stop him, Eli darted across the room. His small hands found Jake's face, turning it toward him. Those innocent eyes met Jake's bloodshot ones, and Eli whispered that single word, try. The dam broke. Jake's entire body convulsed with sobs, tears streaming down his face as his son's small hands held him steady. All his failures, all his shame, all his fear poured out in waves of grief and regret. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence, broken only by Jake's ragged breathing as he tried to compose himself after Eli's whispered plea. His son's small hands were still pressed against his tear-stained cheeks, those innocent eyes full of unwavering faith. The judge leaned forward, studying Jake with a mixture of weariness and contemplation. I should revoke your rights, Mr. Turner, the judge said finally, his voice echoing through the quiet chamber. But I won't. Not yet. Jake's legs nearly gave out from relief. He steadied himself against the table as the judge continued outlining the terms: supervised visitation only, mandatory return to rehab, weekly drug tests. One more slip, and it would all be over. Do you understand the gravity of this decision, Mr. Turner? The judge asked firmly. Yes, Your Honor, Jake managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. The bailiff stepped forward but paused when the judge nodded, allowing Jake and Eli a moment together. Jake knelt down to his son's level, trying to memorize every detail of his face. Eli's arms wrapped around his neck, holding on as if afraid to let go. I won't let you down again, buddy, I swear it, Jake whispered, fighting to keep his voice steady. He could smell the familiar scent of Eli's shampoo, feel the warmth of his small body against his chest. The thought that he'd nearly thrown this away for a bottle made him sick to his stomach. When they finally separated, Jake walked out of the courtroom on shaky legs. Before he could reach the exit, Evelyn caught his arm. Her face was unreadable, but her grip was firm. If you mean it, prove it, she said simply, her eyes searching his face. Jake nodded, his jaw clenched tight. I will. The courthouse steps were cold and hard as Jake sat down, letting the crisp air clear his head. He pulled out his 90-day sobriety chip from his pocket, the one he'd earned before throwing it all away in one night of weakness. The metal felt heavy in his palm, a reminder of what he'd achieved and lost. He closed his fist around it tightly. Try, he whispered to himself, echoing his son's word. It wasn't just a plea anymore, it was a promise. Standing up, Jake turned away from the courthouse. This time, his feet didn't lead him toward a bar or a liquor store. Instead, he headed back to rehab, back to the fight he should never have abandoned, back to the long road of earning his son's trust again. The autumn breeze rustled through the schoolyard as Jake stood outside Eli's elementary school, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his worn but clean jacket. His fingers nervously played with his one-year sobriety chip, a constant reminder of how far he'd come. The brick building loomed before him, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun. A few parents gave him curious glances, but he kept his eyes fixed on the double doors, waiting. Evelyn stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, watching him with careful attention. She'd dressed formally today, as if this moment deserved special recognition. The school bell rang, its sharp chime cutting through the air. Children began pouring out of the building, their excited voices and laughter filling the yard. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as he scanned the sea of small faces. Then, above the chaos of dismissal, he heard it, that voice that had kept him going through his darkest days. "Daddy!" Eli burst through the crowd, his Batman backpack bouncing against his shoulders, his face split into a wide grin that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. Jake dropped to one knee, opening his arms just as Eli crashed into him with the force of pure joy. "You really came," Eli whispered, his small hands gripping Jake's shirt tightly, as if afraid his father might disappear if he let go. Jake's throat tightened with emotion. "I promised, didn't I?" he managed to say, his voice rough with feeling. He breathed in the scent of his son's hair, pencil shavings and grape juice, and that indefinable smell that was purely Eli. Other parents and children streamed around them, but Jake barely noticed. This moment, this first day of unsupervised visits, felt sacred. One full year of sobriety had led to this, the chance to be a real father again. Eli pulled back, his eyes bright with excitement. "Can we get ice cream? And go to the park? And maybe watch a movie?" The words tumbled out in a rush of enthusiasm. "Slow down, buddy," Jake laughed, ruffling Eli's hair. "We've got the whole weekend ahead of us." Evelyn stepped forward, her expression a complex mixture of concern and hope. "He still needs stability," she said quietly, her eyes meeting Jake's. "Don't give him false hope." Jake nodded solemnly. He understood now in a way he hadn't before, that earning trust was like building a house. It had to be done brick by brick, with patience and care. "I know," he replied. "I won't let him down. Not again." They walked to Jake's truck together, Eli's hand warm in his as the boy chattered about his day, about the math test he'd aced and the funny joke his friend Tommy had told at lunch. Jake listened to every word, savoring this simple moment he'd dreamed about during countless therapy sessions and lonely nights. At the truck, Jake helped Eli climb into the back seat, making sure the seatbelt was secure. His son looked up at him with those trusting eyes, that beautiful smile still lighting up his face. "I waited so long for this," Eli said softly. Jake gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as emotion threatened to overwhelm him. "Me too, buddy," he managed to say. "Me too." Jake's hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as he caught another glimpse of Eli in the rearview mirror. His son sat contentedly in the back seat, legs swinging freely, making his stuffed lion dance across his lap. The familiar tune Eli hummed filled the truck's cabin, some cartoon theme song Jake didn't recognize. A year's worth of missed moments hit him all at once. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dashboard as they drove through familiar streets. Everything looked different now, clearer, more real. Jake noticed details he'd missed before, the way Eli's hair curled slightly at the ends, just like his had at that age, the small scuff marks on his son's sneakers, the careful way he held his beloved lion. The humming suddenly stopped. In the mirror, Jake saw Eli's expression turn serious, his small face scrunched in thought. "Do I get to stay with you forever now?" Eli asked, his voice small but hopeful. The question hit Jake like a punch to the gut. His fingers tightened on the wheel as he fought to keep his voice steady. "Not yet, bud, but I'm working on it." He braced himself for tears or disappointment, but Eli just nodded, wisdom beyond his years shining in his eyes. "You just have to try, right?" A small, knowing smile played across his son's face. Jake's breath caught in his throat. That word, try. It had become their mantra, their shared promise. He pulled the truck over to the side of the road, needing a moment to collect himself. Turning in his seat, he really looked at his son, this amazing little person who had never given up on him, even when he'd given up on himself. "Yeah," Jake finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. "That's all we can do." Eli unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned forward, his small hand reaching out to touch Jake's arm. He whispered that word again, like a sacred promise between them. "Try." Jake closed his eyes for a moment, letting the word wash over him. When he opened them again, he saw nothing but pure trust in his son's face. He gave a firm nod, steadying himself. Starting the engine again, Jake pulled back onto the road. His grip on the wheel was different now, steady, determined. Each mile that passed felt like another step forward, another chance to prove himself worthy of his son's unwavering faith. Jake guided his truck into the parking spot outside his new apartment building. The place wasn't much, a small one-bedroom unit on the second floor, but he'd worked hard to make it feel like home. For Eli. Everything was for Eli now. "Ready to see where Daddy lives?" Jake asked, helping Eli unbuckle his seatbelt. Eli nodded eagerly, clutching his stuffed lion close as they climbed the stairs. Jake's hands shook slightly as he unlocked the door, nervous about his son's reaction. The apartment was modest but clean. Jake had spent weeks getting it ready, making sure everything was perfect. There were child-proof locks on the cabinets, fresh sheets on the pull-out couch where Eli would sleep, and carefully chosen decorations that made the space feel warm and lived in. Eli's eyes went wide as he explored, taking in every detail. He stopped suddenly at the kitchen counter, pointing at a framed photograph. It showed Jake and Eli at the park, both smiling broadly. Jake had kept it safe through all his time in rehab. "This is yours?" Eli asked, his voice filled with wonder. Jake's throat tightened as he corrected gently. "Ours, buddy. This is our home." The kitchen soon filled with the smell of spaghetti and meatballs. Nothing fancy, but Jake had practiced cooking during his recovery. As he stirred the sauce, Eli perched on a kitchen chair, talking nonstop about everything Jake had missed. "And then Tommy brought his pet hamster to show and tell," Eli explained, swinging his legs. "And Mrs. Peterson let us hold it. And I got an A on my math test, and Jenny said my lion was cool." Jake listened to every word, soaking in the simple joy of being present. There was no craving, no anxiety churning in his gut, just the warm contentment of being exactly where he needed to be. After dinner, Eli's eyes started drooping, but he insisted, "I want to sleep in your bed, Daddy." "Please." Jake couldn't refuse. He helped Eli change into his pajamas and brush his teeth. Soon, Eli was curled up in Jake's bed, his beloved lion tucked securely under his chin. His breathing grew steady and deep as sleep took hold. Jake sat on the edge of the bed, watching his son's peaceful face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his 1-year sobriety chip, running his thumb over its smooth surface. The weight of it felt right in his palm, a reminder of how far he'd come, of everything he'd fought to keep. For the first time since starting his recovery, Jake felt truly worthy of this second chance. Not perfect, but trying. Always trying. He carefully pulled the blanket up around Eli's shoulders, whispering, "Good night, buddy." Eli stirred slightly in his sleep, mumbling softly, "Love you, Daddy." Jake's heart swelled so much it almost hurt. He leaned down and whispered back, "I love you too, kid." The digital clock on Jake's nightstand blinked 12 a.m. He lay still in his bed, hands folded across his chest, listening to Eli's soft, rhythmic breathing beside him. The boy had insisted on sleeping next to him, curled up with his lion, one small hand gripping Jake's shirt even in sleep. Jake couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this kind of peace. Not the artificial numbness alcohol used to bring, but something real and deep. Still, sleep wouldn't come. His mind was too full, his heart too heavy with the weight of this moment. He turned his head slightly, studying Eli's peaceful face in the dim light filtering through the curtains. His son looked so innocent, so trusting. The thought squeezed Jake's chest tight. How many times had he betrayed that trust? How many promises had he broken? Careful not to wake Eli, Jake slipped out of bed and padded to the small balcony. The night air was cool against his skin as he settled into the single plastic chair he'd placed out there. Above him, stars dotted the clear sky, countless pinpoints of light in the darkness. The familiar urge crept in as it always did when his emotions ran high. That whispered promise of escape, of numbness. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the arms of the chair, but this time was different. This time he didn't try to push the feeling away or fight it. He acknowledged it, let it wash over him, and watched it fade. He didn't need a drink, not anymore, not with Eli's try echoing in his heart. Jake pulled out his phone, its screen bright in the darkness. He opened his messages and typed a simple text to Gerald, his sponsor. Thank you. 2 words that carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. The response came quickly. Keep fighting, Turner. Jake smiled slightly, pocketing his phone. He stood up, taking one last look at the stars before heading back inside. In the bedroom, Eli had rolled over, his lion dangling precariously off the edge of the bed. Jake gently tucked it back into his son's arms and smoothed the blanket over him. As he lay back down, Eli instinctively snuggled closer, seeking his father's warmth. Jake wrapped an arm around him, protective and gentle. I'm going to keep trying, he whispered into the darkness. And for the first time in his life, he truly meant it. The words weren't just a promise or a hope. They were a truth he felt in his bones. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across Jake's small bedroom. He stirred awake, momentarily confused by the warm weight pressed against his side. His heart skipped a beat before his mind caught up. It was Eli, still sleeping peacefully beside him, clutching his stuffed lion. As Jake watched, Eli began to stir, his small body stretching like a cat. Those familiar brown eyes blinked open, still clouded with sleep. For a split second, panic gripped Jake's chest. He hadn't woken up sober with his son in years. What if he messed this up too? But then Eli smiled, that pure, trusting smile that made Jake's heart ache. I'm hungry, he announced simply, rubbing his eyes with tiny fists. Jake swallowed hard. Okay, buddy. Let's see what we can make. He led Eli to the kitchen, trying to remember the last time he'd actually cooked anything more complicated than microwave meals. Standing in front of the stove, Jake stared at the pancake mix like it was written in another language. His hands shook slightly as he measured the ingredients, spilling some flour on the counter. Can I help? Eli asked, dragging a chair over to stand on. Sure, Jake said, helping him climb up. Just be careful, okay? The first batch was a disaster. Black on the outside, gooey in the middle. Jake cursed under his breath, ready to give up, but Eli just giggled. It's okay, Daddy. The next ones will be better. Jake couldn't help but chuckle, ruffling Eli's messy hair. Yeah, we'll try again. By the third attempt, they managed to make something edible. They sat at the small kitchen table, Eli's legs swinging happily as he drowned his slightly misshapen pancakes in syrup. Jake watched him, amazed by how normal this felt. Just a father and son having breakfast together. Eli chatted between bites, telling Jake about his teacher, his best friend Tommy, and the book they were reading in class. Jake found himself hanging on every word, realizing how much he'd missed of his son's life. As he stood at the sink washing dishes, familiar doubts began creeping in. Could he really do this? Be a real father? Keep his promises? Stay sober? The weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. But then he felt a small tug on his sleeve. Eli looked up at him with hopeful eyes. Can we go to the park today? Jake pushed the doubts aside, focusing on his son's eager face. Yeah, buddy, he smiled. Let's go. The afternoon sun warmed Jake's face as he watched Eli dash toward the playground swings, his small sneakers kicking up wood chips along the way. The familiar creak of swing chains and children's laughter filled the air. For a brief moment, Jake felt like any other parent spending a Saturday at the park with their kid. Daddy, look how high I can go, Eli called out, his legs pumping furiously as he tried to get the swing moving. Jake smiled, leaning against a nearby bench. The simple joy on Eli's face made his heart swell. This was what normal felt like, what being a real father felt like. But the peace didn't last long. A group of parents huddled near the monkey bars caught his attention. Their whispers carried on the breeze. Isn't that Jake Turner? One woman muttered. The drunk who almost killed his kid driving? Another responded. Can't believe they let him have visitation. Jake's shoulders tensed. The familiar weight of shame pressed down on him as Clara, a mother he recognized from the neighborhood, shot him a disapproving glare. His hands curled into fists in his pockets. The urge to grab Eli and leave, to run from their judgment, was overwhelming. Daddy, can you push me? Eli's voice cut through the whispers. Please. Jake swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay put. He wouldn't let their words drive him away from this moment with his son. Walking to the swings, he positioned himself behind Eli. "Ready, buddy?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Super high," Eli giggled, gripping the chains tightly. As Jake pushed the swing, a man approached from the side. He was tall with graying temples. David, another regular at the playground. Jake braced himself for more judgment, but David surprised him by extending his hand. "Takes real guts to get your life back on track," David said quietly. "Good for you, man." Jake stared at the offered hand for a moment before shaking it, thrown off by the unexpected support. "Thanks," he managed. "Higher, Daddy," Eli squealed, oblivious to the exchange. His face was pure joy as he soared through the air. "This is the best day ever." Jake felt something loosen in his chest. The whispers were still there, but they seemed less important now. What mattered was Eli's laughter, his trust, his happiness. One day at a time, Jake whispered to himself, pushing the swing again as Eli reached for the sky. Jake sat in his truck, hands still gripping the steering wheel, watching the porch light flicker on at Evelyn's house. The evening air was cooling, and shadows stretched long across the neat suburban lawn. His muscles ached from a day of pushing swings and chasing his son around the playground, but it was a good kind of tired. Evelyn appeared on the porch, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her face was impossible to read in the growing darkness. Jake took a deep breath and stepped out of the truck, gravel crunching under his feet. They stood in silence for a moment, the crickets chirping in the background. Finally, Evelyn spoke, her voice careful and measured. "He was happy today." Jake nodded, stuffing his hands in his pockets. "Yeah, I think he had fun." She exhaled slowly, studying his face. "And you? Are you still clean?" Jake felt his shoulders tense at the question, but he forced himself to stay calm. 1 year, 2 months, and 16 days, he answered truthfully. He'd counted every single one. Evelyn gave an approving nod, but then her expression hardened. "But are you ready for what comes next?" The question hung heavy in the air between them. Being sober is one thing, being a father every single day is another. Jake leaned against his truck, running a hand through his hair. "Sometimes I still doubt myself," he admitted quietly. "I wake up terrified I'll mess up again." "Eli adores you," Evelyn said firmly, "but he needs consistency. If you fall again, it will break him." Her words cut straight to his core. "I won't relapse again," Jake promised, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't do that to him. Not again." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she sighed, her rigid posture softening slightly. "I want to believe you." She paused, then gestured toward the house. "Come inside. Have some coffee. We should talk about the next custody hearing." Jake hesitated for a moment, surprised by the invitation. Then he nodded, following her up the porch steps. As they stepped inside the warm house, he realized this was the first time in years they were actually talking like family, not enemies. Jake jolted awake, his t-shirt damp with sweat. The digital clock on his nightstand cast an eerie red glow across the darkened room. His heart hammered against his ribs as fragments of the nightmare lingered. Eli's desperate cries, the judge's stern face, the sound of a gavel sealing his fate. He swung his legs over the bed, hands trembling as he tried to steady his breathing. The silence of his apartment felt oppressive, too much like the emptiness he'd lived with during his drinking days. The memory of Eli's laughter from earlier that day seemed distant now, drowned out by his inner demons. In the bathroom, the harsh fluorescent light made him squint. His reflection showed a man he barely recognized, clean-shaven, clear-eyed but terrified. The cold water shocked his system as he splashed it over his face, trying to wash away the lingering terror of the dream. That's when the craving hit, like an old friend whispering in his ear, promising relief from the fear and doubt. His mouth went dry at the thought of whiskey burning down his throat. One drink. Just to take the edge off. No one would know. Jake's fingers found his phone, muscle memory taking him to his contacts. His thumb hovered over a name he should have deleted months ago. Mike, his old dealer who always knew where to score the good stuff. The screen's glow illuminated his shaking hands. Instead of pressing call, he shut the screen off. The darkness felt suffocating. With trembling fingers, he scrolled to another name. Mark. His sponsor picked up on the third ring. "It's late, Turner." Mark's voice was thick with sleep. "Yeah," Jake managed, his voice rough. "But I needed to hear a voice that's not my own." He slid down the bathroom wall until he sat on the cold tile floor. The sobriety chip in his pocket pressed against his leg, a reminder of how far he'd come, of what he stood to lose. "Had the dream again?" Jake admitted, running a hand over his face. "The one where they take him away." "Fear is part of it," Mark replied, his voice steadying. "But fear isn't failure." Jake pulled out his sobriety chip, turning it over in his palm. The metal felt cool against his skin. "I won't lose him," he whispered, as much to himself as to Mark. After the call ended, Jake dragged himself back to bed. The sheets felt damp and uncomfortable, but he forced himself to lie down. Sleep wouldn't come easily. It never did after nights like this. He stared at the ceiling, his heart still pounding too fast. In the darkness, he whispered one word: "Try." It echoed in the empty room, a promise and a prayer all at once. Tomorrow was another day. He just had to keep going. The morning sunlight streamed through Jake's bedroom window as Eli's excited bouncing made the mattress squeak. "Wake up, Daddy, church day." Eli's voice rang with enthusiasm, his small hands patting Jake's shoulder. Jake cracked open his eyes, taking in his son's neatly combed hair and pressed Sunday clothes. Evelyn's doing, no doubt. The thought of church made his stomach twist. He hadn't stepped inside one since before his drinking got bad, back when he still pretended to be the man everyone wanted him to be. All right, kiddo, let's go," Jake mumbled, forcing himself to sit up. His head still felt heavy from last night's anxiety, but Eli's bright smile made it impossible to say no. At the church steps, Jake hesitated. The white wooden doors loomed before him, familiar yet strange. Inside, the whispers started immediately. He caught fragments of conversations dying as he passed, saw heads turn and eyes narrow. Eli, innocent to it all, tugged him eagerly toward the front pews. "Jake Turner," Pastor Mitchell's deep voice carried across the sanctuary. The older man approached with an outstretched hand. "Glad to see you back." Jake shifted his weight, acutely aware of his worn jacket and the judgmental stares burning into his back. Still, he shook the pastor's hand, managing a quiet nod. The organ music swelled as the service began. Jake sat stiffly, hyper-aware of every movement, every whisper. The sermon's theme hit him like a punch to the gut: redemption. Pastor Mitchell spoke about second chances, about the power of change. Jake's collar felt too tight. Beside him, Eli swayed to the hymns, his clear voice joining the congregation without hesitation. The boy's simple joy cut through Jake's discomfort. This was why he was here. Not for himself, but for his son. After the final prayer, an elderly woman approached them. Her weathered face creased with kindness as she took Jake's hand in both of hers. "People can change, son," she said softly. "Keep going." The warmth in her eyes caught him off guard. For the first time since entering the church, Jake felt his shoulders relax slightly. Others followed her lead, offering small nods or brief greetings. Not everyone. Some still kept their distance, their disapproval clear, but enough to make Jake realize that not all doors were closed to him. In the parking lot, Eli bounced on his toes, face glowing with excitement. "That was fun. Can we come next week?" He looked up at Jake with those trusting eyes that always seemed to see the best in him. Jake swallowed hard, pushing down his instinct to run from uncomfortable situations. "Yeah, bud," he said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "We can." Eli's face lit up even brighter as he grabbed Jake's hand, swinging it as they walked to the car. Jake's truck idled in Evelyn's driveway, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as he fought the familiar ache in his chest. These goodbyes never got easier. "And then Tommy shared his cookies with me at lunch." Eli continued his stream of weekend stories from the back seat. hugging his stuffed lion close. And Pastor Mitchell said I sang real good. Jake caught his son's bright eyes in the rearview mirror, forcing down the lump in his throat. Time to go inside, kiddo. His voice came out rougher than he intended. The change in Eli's expression was instant. His shoulders slumped, and his bottom lip trembled slightly. I don't want to go, he whispered, clutching his lion tighter. Jake climbed out and opened the back door, kneeling beside his son. The gravel dug into his knees, but he barely noticed. I know, buddy, but I'll be back next weekend. He tried to sound confident, steady. Eli's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Promise? Jake pressed his hand over his heart, the gesture solemn and true. Cross my heart, kid. He noticed Evelyn watching from the porch, her face carefully neutral. Eli launched himself forward, wrapping his small arms around Jake's neck with surprising strength. Jake held him close, breathing in the scent of his son's shampoo and church clothes, fighting the burning sensation in his eyes. Be good for Grandma, all right? Jake managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. He felt Eli nod against his shoulder before finally letting go. As Eli ran inside, his lion bouncing against his leg, Evelyn stepped down from the porch. Her eyes followed her grandson before settling on Jake. You did good, Jake. The words were quiet but sincere. Jake exhaled slowly, nodding. The weekend had felt both endless and too short. I just need more time. The admission cost him something, but he forced it out anyway. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. Then she gestured toward the house. Let's talk about getting you that time. Jake's heart pounded against his ribs as he followed her lead, hope and fear warring in his chest. The empty apartment echoed with Jake's footsteps as he paced the living room. 10 o'clock, and the silence pressed in from all sides. The weekend with Eli had been perfect. Church, park visits, pancake breakfasts. But now it was just him and his thoughts. His eyes drifted to the kitchen cabinet where he kept the whiskey bottle. He'd bought it months ago, telling himself it was a test of willpower. The amber liquid caught the dim light, almost glowing. One drink wouldn't hurt, just to take the edge off, just to fill this crushing emptiness. Jake's hands trembled as he gripped the kitchen counter, his knuckles turning white. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the familiar craving clawed at his insides. The bottle seemed to mock him from behind the cabinet door. What if I mess everything up again? He whispered to the empty room. What if I'm not strong enough? His throat felt tight, desperate for that burning sensation of whiskey. His phone buzzed on the counter, making him jump. Mark's name flashed across the screen, checking in. You good? Jake stared at the message, then back at the bottle. His hand hovered between them, phone or whiskey, salvation or destruction. After what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, he grabbed the phone. I want to drink, he admitted as soon as Mark answered, his voice rough with shame. Tell me about it, Mark replied simply, no judgment in his tone. For the next hour, Jake poured out everything. How the silence felt like a physical weight. How seeing Eli's empty bedroom made his chest ache. How terrified he was of failing again. Mark just listened, occasionally offering quiet words of encouragement. You know what matters here? Mark finally said. You called me instead of opening that bottle. That's progress, Jake. Real progress. By the time they hung up, Jake's breathing had steadied. The whiskey bottle still sat in the cabinet, untouched. He stood up, legs slightly shaky, and locked the cabinet door. Not tonight, he muttered, pocketing the key. Exhausted, but somehow lighter, Jake sank onto the couch. His hands weren't trembling anymore. For the first time since getting sober, he'd faced the temptation head-on and won. The victory felt small but significant. Another tiny step forward, another day earned with his son. Jake stood in his kitchen, the morning light filtering through the dusty windows as he waited for his coffee to brew. The familiar aroma filled the small space, a comfort he'd learned to appreciate since getting sober. His mind wandered to the weekend with Eli, their laughter, the church visit, those burnt pancakes. A sharp knock jolted him from his thoughts. He glanced at the clock. 8 a.m. Too early for most visitors. Frowning, he walked to the door, his bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. When he opened it, Evelyn stood there, dressed in her usual neat attire, clutching a manila folder to her chest. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something different in her eyes. "Is everything okay?" Jake asked, tension creeping into his shoulders. His mind raced. Had something happened to Eli? Evelyn hesitated, then thrust the folder toward him. "This is a petition for increased visitation." Jake's hands trembled as he took the folder, flipping through the crisp pages inside. Legal terms jumped out at him. Extended custody, overnight visits, shared responsibility. His heart pounded against his ribs. Evelyn crossed her arms, watching him carefully. "I've been watching, Jake. You're trying. And Eli needs his father." He looked up from the papers, throat tight. "You really think I'm ready?" She sighed, her stern expression softening slightly. "I think you're close." "Thank you," Jake managed, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't thank me yet." Evelyn's tone was firm but not unkind. "Prove to the court that you're ready." Jake nodded, determination flooding through him. This was real. A real chance to be the father Eli deserved. Evelyn reached out, placing a weathered hand on his shoulder. The gesture was brief but meaningful, the first time she'd touched him voluntarily in years. Then she turned to leave, pausing only to say, "Don't screw this up." Jake closed the door behind her, leaning against it. The folder felt heavy in his hands, weighted with possibility and responsibility. This was his shot. He wouldn't waste it. Jake stood outside the courthouse, his hands clenched into fists. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and possibility. He'd walked up these steps countless times before, but today felt different. His suit, borrowed from Mark, felt stiff and formal, but he stood straighter, shoulders back, chin up. This time, he wasn't here to make excuses or beg for mercy. He was here to prove himself. Evelyn stepped beside him, adjusting her navy blue coat against the autumn chill. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back neatly, her expression carefully neutral. "You ready for this?" she asked, studying his face. Jake exhaled slowly, watching his breath mist in the cool air. "I have to be." Inside the courtroom, the polished wooden benches gleamed under fluorescent lights. Jake's footsteps echoed as he made his way to his seat, trying not to fidget with his tie. His eyes found Eli in the back row, small legs swinging nervously, that familiar stuffed lion clutched tightly to his chest. The sight made Jake's throat tight. He gave his son a small, reassuring nod, hoping his own nervousness didn't show. When the judge entered, everyone rose. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as the judge settled into his chair, shuffling through papers with practiced efficiency. The proceedings began, and Jake's lawyer presented his case with quiet confidence. "Your Honor, Mr. Turner has maintained continuous sobriety for 14 months, his lawyer stated, gesturing to the stack of documentation. He's held steady employment at Anderson Construction for the past year, completed our recommended parenting classes with excellent feedback, and has never missed or been late to a single supervised visitation." The CPS representative stood next, her report equally encouraging. Eli has shown marked emotional improvement since increased contact with his father. His teachers report better focus in school, and his anxiety symptoms have decreased significantly. Jake kept his eyes forward, hands clasped tightly in his lap. Each positive report felt like a small victory, but he didn't dare hope too much. Not yet. The judge turned to Evelyn, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Turner, you've been Eli's primary guardian throughout this process. Do you believe he's ready?" Evelyn stood slowly, and Jake held his breath. There was a moment of heavy silence before she spoke, her voice firm and clear. "Yes, Your Honor. He's proven himself." Jake swallowed hard, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear anything else. The judge leaned forward, fixing Jake with an intense stare. Mr. Turner, do you understand that gaining custody is not the end of this journey but the beginning of another responsibility? Jake rose to his feet, standing as straight as he could. Yes, Your Honor, and I'm ready. The judge sighed, tapping his fingers thoughtfully on the bench before delivering his verdict. Full custody will be reinstated in a 6-month transition period. Mr. Turner, I hope you continue proving yourself. From the back of the courtroom, Eli let out a joyful cheer. Jake, for the first time in years, allowed himself to breathe, really breathe. The weight that had been pressing on his chest for so long finally began to lift. Jake lay in his darkened apartment, the victory of the day turning sour in his stomach. The ceiling seemed to press down on him as thoughts raced through his mind. He'd done it. He'd actually won back custody of Eli. But instead of feeling triumphant, his chest tightened with a familiar panic. What if I mess up again? He whispered to the empty room. What if I can't handle it? His breathing grew shallow as scenarios played through his head. Missing school pickups, forgetting doctor's appointments, losing his temper. Worse yet, the thought that terrified him most. Taking that first drink and watching it all crumble away. Unable to stay still, Jake pushed himself up and began pacing the small apartment. His footsteps echoed off the bare walls as sweat beaded on his forehead. The responsibility felt like a physical weight on his shoulders, crushing him with each step. Then it started, the itch under his skin, the burning in his throat. The craving hit him like a punch to the gut. Just one drink, his mind whispered, just to calm the nerves, just to take the edge off. Before he knew it, he was in his truck driving through the quiet streets. He found himself parked outside Pete's liquor store, the neon open sign casting a sickly glow across his face. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. Jake stared at the store entrance, his whole body trembling. One drink. That's all it would take to quiet the fear. But one drink had never been just one drink. With shaking fingers, he pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, thumb hovering first over Mark's number, then moving to a photo of Eli, grinning wide, missing his front tooth, eyes full of trust. Damn it, Jake muttered, forcing himself to look away from the liquor store. He jammed the key back in the ignition and peeled out of the parking lot, tires squealing. 10 minutes later, he stood on Mark's front porch, knocking harder than he meant to. The porch light flickered on, and Mark appeared in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, eyes heavy with sleep but instantly alert when he saw Jake's face. "Come in, Jake," Mark said simply, stepping aside. Jake stumbled into Mark's living room, collapsing onto the worn couch. He buried his face in his hands, shame and relief warring in his chest. "I almost did it," he choked out. "I almost threw it all away. First day of getting him back, and I nearly—" His voice cracked. Mark disappeared into the kitchen, returning with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He pressed one into Jake's trembling hands. "But you didn't," Mark said firmly. "And that's what matters." Jake stood outside Eli's elementary school, hands tucked casually in his pockets. The autumn breeze ruffled his hair as he leaned against his truck, the same truck from that terrible night 2 years ago, but now clean and well-maintained, just like its owner. Other parents gathered nearby, but their whispers no longer bothered him. He'd earned his place here. The familiar brick building loomed before him, but today it felt different. No knots in his stomach, no trembling hands, no urge to run or hide or drink. Because today wasn't just another pickup. It was the beginning of their new life together. The bell rang, its shrill tone cutting through the afternoon air. Doors burst open as kids poured out, their excited voices filling the schoolyard. Jake straightened up, scanning the crowd until he spotted that familiar mop of brown hair. Eli emerged from the double doors, his backpack bouncing against his shoulder. When their eyes met, his whole face lit up. "Daddy!" He took off running, weaving between other students, his untied shoelaces flying. Jake knelt down, arms open wide, bracing himself as Eli crashed into him with the force of a small hurricane. "We did it, Daddy!" Eli shouted, squeezing tight enough to make Jake's ribs protest. Jake closed his eyes, breathing in the familiar scent of his son's hair, feeling the solid warmth of him. "Yeah, bud, we did." Eli pulled back, bouncing on his toes. "Can we get pizza? And watch movies? And stay up late?" Because it's our house now, right? Our real house? Jake chuckled, ruffling Eli's hair. Slow down, kiddo, we've got all the time in the world. Eli's expression suddenly turned serious. He grabbed Jake's face between his small hands, just like he had in the courtroom that day. You kept your promise, he said softly. Jake swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. Yeah, kid. I did. Eli leaned in close, his breath tickling Jake's ear as he whispered that one word, the word that had changed everything. Try. Jake pulled his son close again, his voice steady and sure as he whispered back, always. They walked toward the truck hand in hand, Eli swinging their joined hands between them. The afternoon sun caught his son's smile, and Jake felt something settle in his chest, a quiet certainty that this was exactly where they were meant to be. Jake stood in the doorway of Eli's new bedroom, watching as his son burrowed deeper under the freshly washed dinosaur print blankets. The nightlight cast a soft glow across the room, making shadows dance on walls decorated with carefully hung drawings and photos. Can we go to the park tomorrow? Eli asked through a yawn, clutching his stuffed lion close. Jake smiled, moving to sit on the edge of the bed. We can do whatever you want, kiddo. He tucked the blanket more securely around Eli's shoulders. Eli's eyes were already growing heavy, but he fought to keep them open. I love you, Daddy. The words hit Jake square in the chest, filling him with a warmth he'd never known before getting sober. This wasn't the desperate, guilty love of his drinking days. This was pure, earned, and real. I love you too, buddy, Jake whispered, gently stroking Eli's hair. He watched as his son's breathing evened out, small fingers still wrapped around the lion's worn mane. For several minutes, Jake just sat there, taking in every detail of this moment. The peaceful expression on Eli's face, the quiet whir of the ceiling fan, the distant sound of traffic outside their apartment, their home, their real home. Finally, he stood and quietly made his way to the living room. Settling onto the couch, Jake pulled his one-year sobriety chip from his pocket. The metal felt cool against his palm as he traced the engraved numbers with his thumb. He exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. The weight of everything, the responsibility, the joy, the fear, the triumph, settled around him like a familiar blanket. Not suffocating anymore, just present. Reaching for his phone, Jake dialed a number he knew by heart. Hey Mark, just checking in. His sponsor's warm chuckle came through the line. That's good, Turner. That's real good. Jake leaned back on the couch, a small smile playing on his lips. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. But for the first time, he knew. He wasn't going anywhere. If you enjoyed the story of Jake, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.